These notes are going to cover some invasions that happen in Europe in the Middle Ages that lead to the system of feudalism, and then exactly what feudalism itself is. So we're going to start with the Vikings. The Vikings come from Scandinavia, which if you check down here in the map, you have this purple area, that's Scandinavia, that's where the Vikings are from. The Vikings are Norsemen. They were a society that would essentially make their living pillaging. They would attack places and then ransack, and they would bring the goods back to their homeland. They also had some small farms, but in Scandinavia, obviously, there's a very short growing season, so they wouldn't be able to provide for their families for the whole year on that way. They were exceptional scalers, exceptional fighters who would have attacked all kinds of places in Europe, and I'm going to pull that map up in just a second and show you. But ultimately, they're going to convert to Christianity and spread into Russia, and the Russian culture that already had Slavic and Greek and Byzantine influences gets a lot of Viking influences as well, which creates this sort of unique Russian culture. The Vikings are also famous for having been one of the earliest Europeans to make it to the New World. Leif Erikson was a Viking, and his crew hit Newfoundland in Canada. So they sailed all the way across the Atlantic about 500 years or so before Columbus did. This map, if I make it bigger, is going to show you, and I'm going to have to bring it to the front, is going to show you all of the different routes that the Vikings would have attacked. And if you notice, they came across from the north and then down through Russia and ransacked Constantinople. They also went the other way between the British Isles and down through the Strait of Gibraltar here and hit Italy. In the 800s, the 9th century, they were attacking all over Europe. The Angles and the Saxons are the two groups that are going to create England and northern France. England is actually called the land of the Angles. That's where England comes from. And then Saxons are going to form Saxony, which is a region of France. They originally came from Germany, from Central Europe. If you pull up this picture really quickly, the Saxon coast here is closer to the Netherlands. And then the Angles and the Saxons moved in from this region just north of Germany across into Britain. They become the dominant group of the Middle Ages because of their role in England most notably, but also that the Angles and the Saxons of France, northern Europe, are going to create the culture of court that all of the nobility were belonging to all throughout Europe. The Magyars were from Hungary. So Hungary is this green area on this map. Down here it's more Eastern Central Europe, and they're going to be much, again, like the Mongols, they're going to be another group that attacks and flees for the same reasons that the Vikings and the Mongols were doing it. And they also were famous for enslaving people. The Vikings didn't generally bring very many people back home with them. Neither did the Mongols, really. The Mongols instilled tribute governments in the places they took over. And the Magyars did a lot of the taking over of regions. This map shows you that in the 900s, so just after the height of the just after the height of the Vikings, the Magyars do the exact same thing to pretty much the same places. And it's all these invasions that are going to lead to the system of feudalism that we bring in. The Europeans understand that they need protection from all of these invaders, so what they're going to do is create a feudal system. The order of things is completely disrupted. I mean, every time that you're being ransacked, it's going to hinder trade. You're not going to be able to have these big, large empires because everybody's trying to be protected. And so what we create instead is a manor system. And the manors are generally built with castles. And if I actually, like, obviously that's a castle, but if I bring this picture up of the castle, you can see that inside of a castle walls, there are these big open spaces. And they're designed that way so that the people in the surrounding area, the people of the manor, the peasants, can be brought inside the castle walls. Then the drawbridge can be brought up in order to close everything off, and then you were protected from the invasions. So it's actually why we create manors. And if you pull this picture up, oops, if we pull this one up and bring it to the front, you can see that a manor doesn't just have a castle, but it has all these different areas in order to make a self-sustaining system for Europe itself. So that's what self-sufficient means, is that you wouldn't have to trade with anyone because your manor is going to be by itself. So legionnaires, remember the Roman soldiers, were not working anymore because Rome doesn't exist anymore. And so landholders, people who got land, created these feudal agreements. And so if you look at this picture, you have a king at the top. We have our king. And the king owned, obviously, all the land in the kingdom. But he would give the land to lords. And the lords would pledge loyalty to the king. They would back the king. They would support the king. If they were going to go to war, if the king needed to go to war, then the lords would provide the soldiers for the king in exchange for land. So the king gets some protection, but the king also gets service, and the lords get land. Below the lords, and lords can have multiple different titles. You can have dukes and that sort of thing. But below the lords, you're going to have knights. Knights are given, again, from the lords some land. Smaller pieces, obviously, than what the lord would initially own. But the knights were also going to be responsible for fighting for the lord and fighting for the king. They also generally had a lady that they were fighting for. Generally, it's the lord's wife. It's never, throughout history, it's very, very rare that the knight would be fighting for a lady he'd ever actually had a relationship with. That's a big myth of culture. And then below them are the peasants. So the knights are going to fight for the lords to keep the peasants safe. What do the peasants do for everyone? Well, they're doing all the grunt work. They're the farmers, they're the blacksmiths, they're the cobblers, the shoemakers, the coopers, the barrel makers. They're the ones who are controlling daily life. They're the ones running the farms, running the manors. And they get to work on the land for free or for tiny, tiny amounts of money. But they are being protected. The knights and the lords are protecting the peasants. And everyone falls into this system. So feudalism is how the political structure actually develops, where you have this system of loyalty based on land exchange. And it's going to emerge, if you notice, at the same time that the Vikings were at their height. So the land is called a fief. The landowner, the lord, gives the land to someone, the knights and the lords, and they're called vassals. So vassals receive it in exchange for services. The knights work for the lords in exchange for land and money, and the peasants, they don't really get to move. They're sort of stuck, mostly because they're not getting paid anything, but they have to stay in this system and work because everything they work on, everything that they do belongs to the lord, belongs to the vassal. Nothing is their own. Every single thing they have is on the land of the Lord, so therefore it all belongs to him. The king is at the top. Then next in the social structure are going to be the nobles and the knights, the people who are going to fight for the king. Below them are going to be the monks, the nuns, the church officials, the clergy. And then below them are going to be the peasants, everybody else. Now notice, when we talked about the church, we talked about how there's a hierarchy system to the church itself. Priests and everyday sort of contact people in the church are going to be in this those who pray system. But the higher up you go in the hierarchy, you also start to own land and have a higher social structure. So therefore, there are going to be officials in the church, like archbishops and cardinals, who are going to be closer to the top of the social structure, despite the fact that they don't actually fight. So these are just two pictures to show you a little bit more of how this system works. And actually, oh, that's all that's on this slide. There's a picture in your packet. There's a triangle. If you flip through, there's a triangle in your packet of a chart similar to this, and that's actually this is actually what you use to fill it out with the different levels, and the land goes down while the food and services, the loyalty, and the protection go up. This is another way, another image to look for it that way too. So you can see that the king gives the fiefs in exchange for loyalty and military assistance. The lords give food, shelter, and protection, while the knights pay homage, or they work for the lord and provide military service. And then the peasants receive food, shelter, and protection the same way that the knights do, but in exchange they farm the land and pay the rent. Now, the manor is the actual system itself. Feudalism is a social structure, the protection and the services system with the kings and the lords and the peasants. The manor is the actual way that the economy works. So the serfs do all the work, and everything then belongs to the lord, and the lord basically allows you to live on his land and do his work for him for pretty much free. So you're not really a slave, because technically you're not owned, but you don't really ever get to leave, so it's not much better. Except that you do live with your family and you can't get sold off to somebody else. The manor includes every aspect of what you would visualize as a town. So there's churches and there's buildings and there's merchants and there's markets, and every single thing that would be in a town actually all belonged on the same land, because we're talking about tens of thousands of acres in each system. Fields are divided into spring planting, fall planting, and then a set-aside field, a fallow field. This is all about crop rotation, so that you leave some fields out to fallow in order for the nutrients to replenish, and then you add things that we planted in the spring. Things like lettuce are planted in the spring, and then things that are going to be planted later in the summer, more of your vegetables. Your grains can grow pretty much any time. All of those things are gonna rotate based on what can and can't be grown. And it's based on trying to keep the soil rich. But if you notice in this picture, you have the village, you have woods, you have serfs' homes, you have a mill with a river, and you have a pasture with sheep and all these fields. And of course the big castle. And there's just another picture of that, so you can pause it and take a look at that if you want. Peasants had to pay taxes to use anything in the town, which is hard when you don't have a lot of money to start with. But they also had a tie to the church. We talked about that when we talked about Christianity versus Islam, the fact that 10% of everything you made had to be was a tax you paid to the church. You lived in a pretty horrendous conditions. You lived in a straw thatched building with every member of your family on a dirt floor, and you had horrible life expectancies because your work was hard and dangerous and your conditions were disgusting and you don't know anything about germs. And basically the church taught you that your life was terrible because God needed it to be, and that was the order of things. Knights had a much easier system. Knights were going to be rewarded for their service. They also had a code of chivalry, which was all about laws and order and protection. It was more inclined towards what you do to the wealthy rather than what you do to the everyday person. But there's a code of ethics that knights had to follow, similar to the code of Bushido that the samurai had to follow. Those two fall hand in hand. They began training very early. At the age of 7 or so is when you would start becoming training to be a knight, and you would earn your full knight titles at the age 21. You were trained as a soldier, but in times of peace, you actually did jousting tournaments and that sort of thing, like in the Knight's Tale and Renaissance fairs, in order to fight. It's more of a training ground because you were fighting other knights, and it was also an entertainment for the peasants, so that was nice. And that's all we've got. So that's feudalism and manorialism.